Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live webinar of STADA. And we are a non-profit organization focusing on workforce learning. My name is Roy. I'm one of the STADA's management committee, and I'll be your host for today. Hope you enjoyed it. And Clark is just beside us, just waiting for me to pass the baton over to him. But before that, the topic for today, the learning mess. We've been looking at different learning methodologies, evidence-based models, and every time we're on this learning journey, learning science, and yet there's so much things that we don't know about it. And there's always a lot of different perspective, different advertisement coming in on different concepts and so on and so forth, and yet problems persist. And so here we are. We're gonna take a look at some of the myths with Clark. Well, Clark is currently the executive director of his Innovations learning design system. He's been helping organizations over the world. In fact, we just spoke a while ago that he's familiar with where I am in Singapore. So, we're kind of going to expect a little bit about him to share with us on this topic. Clark is also an international consultant in the field of learning technology. He has held a position in University of New South Wales, in San Diego State Universities and University of California. At the moment, Clark is in California, in one of the offbeat towns, as he says. And in 2012, Clark is recognized as the first e-learning guild master. So with that, I'd like to hand this platform to Clark, and I hope that you all enjoyed together with me this little session on the learning method that Clark has. Thank you, Clark.
Thank you, Roy, and thank you all for being here with us today. I appreciate that you're willing to spend some time and dig into myths. So what I'm going to do right now is start the presentation, make sure we have time to get through the information, and leave plenty of time for questions at the end. And so I'm starting the screen share and starting the presentation. And I hope you're seeing this. If you're not, I hope Roy can let me know.
Yeah.
Thank you. So again, thank you for that gracious introduction, and thank you all for being here with me today. Those who know me know I like to start with a calm image, a scene that helps us relax and open our minds to learning before the carnage begins. I hope you're ready. It has been argued that the most complex thing in the known universe is the human brain. Incredibly powerful, although with limitations, architecture. But the thing I want to talk about today is, should we be trying to make systematic changes in this complex organization with what is effectively snake oil? Obviously, the answer is no. But I want to talk today about debunking learning myths and legends, because we are still seeing these persist in talks, in presentations, in books, and in our practices. And this, I want to suggest, needs to change, and I'll make the case why. I'm Clark Quinn of Quinnovation. On Twitter, I'm at Quinnovator if you happen to be tweeting this. Also a member of the Internet Time Alliance. I want to spend a little bit more time about my background, just so you understand the strange and twisted way I look at the world and can interpret what I say through those filters and recognize where I'm coming from. I saw the connection between computers and learning as an undergraduate. I designed my own major in it. It's been my career ever since. It's my passion. My first job out of college with that degree was designing and programming educational computer games, and that's been a recurrent theme through my career. But I broadened out. I went back to get a PhD in what was effectively applied cognitive science to understand how we think, work, and learn to better design solutions. And that's persisted. That focus on cognition and continuing at the edge of technology, sometimes the bleeding edge, scars to prove it. But it's included mobile and increasingly strategy, but it's all about cognitive and learning sciences and how we use it. And that plays a role in what we're talking about today. So what are we talking about today? What am I talking about when I talk about myths and learning myths and debunking them and superstitions? Well, I've categorized them into three separate types of problems. The first one are myths. The original myths were explanations of the world that helped us understand where we fit and why we belonged. So there's stories that explain the world, but in particular here, I'm talking about myths that are just wrong, that people believe, but they have been proven scientifically to not be valid. A second category are superstitions. These are practices we engage in without necessarily conscious reflection, yet they end up being based on wrong bases, and they're practices we should get rid of. And the final thing are misconceptions. These are things people view one way and other people view another way. Some people say it's the best thing ever, and others people say, no, this is the worst thing ever. And what we need to do is unpack those. And I want to go through just some samples of these to make clear what I'm talking about before we go on and talk about what we should do. So myths. There's a number of them. I want to just go through a limited subset here. The first one is the notion that we can characterize learners by how they learn. It's patently obvious that learners do differ. Anybody who has taught anybody recognizes that different people learn differently. The problem is, can we reliably categorize them in the ways they differ? And the evidence says no. A blue ribbon panel in the UK they categorized 73 different instruments people were using, and they picked 10 representative ones, including, by the way, Myers-Briggs and Kolb. And they subjected them to tests of psychometric validity. This is a scientific method to determine whether they can reliably measure what they say they measure, distinguish between two different things that are truly different, and people test the same reliably. And they found out that there was one that actually did meet all 4 tests of psychometric validity, but it wasn't particularly interesting. It was one dimension. The rest did not. And we still cannot reliably identify how learners differ because they change in context, what you're learning, time of day, phase of the moon. I mean, lots of ways. So we can't reliably categorize people. A second blue ribbon study, this one here in the UK, led by Hal Pasher, who happened to be one of my professors when I was a grad student, tried to say we can adjust learning to adjust for how learners differ. Now, of course, with the problem that we can't reliably identify, but when they did try studies to find, and they did a meta-analysis to look at a variety of different studies that claimed to investigate this, they concluded that there was no evidence that adapting to learning styles helped. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. Generally, it didn't. And there's no evidence now. Now, this is science. We may ultimately come up with better instruments to identify learners, or we may come up with ways to identify it, but we have better ways to deal with this right now, and we'll get to that. Another one, and my colleague Will Thalheimer has sort of led the charge on this, and they finally wrote an article with some academics, is about what's called Dale's cone. And I don't know if you've seen this pyramid, but Dale came up with this, that you learn more from audiovisual than you do from reading, and you do more from doing than you do, and you learn most from teaching others. Somebody somewhere along the way added numbers. It wasn't Dale. And it's been actually attributed to Mickey Chi, and I happen to know her. I did my postdoc where she was teaching. She wouldn't have done this, and you wouldn't get these sorts of numbers. It's just not true. Somebody's made this up. So these are 2 different ways or 3 different ways things can go wrong. The studies don't show what people claim, that the methods they're using are inappropriate. And here you trace it back, and it's not really a valid claim to begin with. Another one, generations or millennials. What you see is that young people differ from the perspective of old people and vice versa. But it turns out that generations isn't a valid way. When you do these scientific analysis, say, what do they value in the workplace? There's no significant difference. What we're seeing instead is probably just age differences. One of the things that was claimed about millennials is that they really like certifications and older people don't care. Well, that's because younger people don't have experience. They need certifications. Older people have experience they can point to. This ends up being much more about age than generation. And it's fair to do that, but if you try and adapt to that, in a sense, you're doing age discrimination. Address people who they are. Another one is the so-called digital native, or the fact that digital means we're going to learn fundamentally differently. First, the digital native, if that was true, they may be more comfortable with technology, but the real acid test is whether they actually learn, are more effective using technology. In that test, they haven't passed. They tested younger people and older people on doing something fundamental, a web search, an internet search. And they found that their queries were not any better than older people. And they found they were no better at evaluating the hits they got. There's no native advantage to having grown up with technology. Similarly, our wetware isn't changing that fast. We may learn different things, we may have different pedagogies, but the way our brains work hasn't changed yet. We haven't adapted that quickly. For one last example, the attention span of a goldfish. And this is another one of tracking back. There was a claim, and it was attributed to Microsoft Canada. And if you read the Microsoft Canada study, you find out they're pointing to something that StatBrain did, and StatBrain is pointing to some research that was about looking at web pages. They said, oh, well, our attention span for web pages dropped. Well, there's a whole bunch of explanations for that, like web pages load faster. We can look at them quicker and make an assessment. And, as well, we might not attribute attention. We might be less willing to devote attention to something that matters because there's more distractions these days. But we can still pay attention for long times. How many, when was the last time you watched a movie or played a computer game and hours disappeared? It just isn't valid. And I want to say there's a whole bunch more that we're just skimming the surface. But these are the types of things I'm talking about. Now, superstitions. Again, these are practices we see that aren't necessarily even articulated. And in some sense, they're not necessarily provably wrong, but they're clearly conceptually wrong. So I want to go through a few examples here. The first one is smile sheets. The notion that if we ask learners what they thought of our learning experience, that input helps us determine the quality of what the outcome is. It turns out the correlation between what people think is the effect of a learning experience and its actual impact is 0. Technically, it's 0.09, which is 0 with a rounding error. This is not a valid assessment. And to the extent that we see this, and the numbers suggest that we do, like 95% of organizations will assess a smile sheet, but only a third will go as far as, actually looking to see if they can pass a test afterwards. And only an eighth are seeing if that leads to any change in the workplace, let alone is it having an impact on the business. Or that clicks will equal engagement. There's this notion that, oh, well, click to see more makes it more engaging than just dumping content. It's still dumping content. Clicks inherently aren't engaging unless they're requiring the learner to commit themselves. There are values to clicks, no argument. But just clicking to putting in more clicks isn't a way to solve the engagement problem. Boiling down the content, a bunch of other things, yes. Or the notion that content dump is going to lead to behavior change. Reading a bunch of bullet points doesn't mean you're going to be able to do anything differently. And yet we continue to see that in our learning experiences, whether it's face-to-face training or online. A lot of knowledge dump, not enough practice, not going to lead to any meaningful change. And there's more. So finally, misconceptions. And these are in some ways most problematic because they are what lend people to hype, to extol things without clarification, and then people get excited about it and spend money and without really making sense of what's going on. So here's some examples. For instance, problem-based learning. Very smart people, research scientists, Paul Kirshner and Richard Clark and John Sweller said, oh, you need direct instruction. This exploratory learning doesn't work. But that's not really what people are pushing as problem-based learning. Way back in '85, Wallace Feuersig said guided discovery, and they're putting up a straw man at this pure exploratory discovery. Instead, Jonathan and then did deep research on problem-based learning and found benefits, and then Strobel and Van Barneveld solidified that with a meta-analysis and found out that you don't do quite as well necessarily on a test right afterwards, but you get retention over time, better retention, and better transfer to appropriate problems. And that's what we should be caring about. So you need to understand, what are we talking about when we say this or not? 70-20-10, incredibly contentious. People say, oh, the numbers around, that never happens. It's not research-based. Other people say, I had a hard time communicating to executives. When I laid out 70-20-10 and aligned it with their own experience, they got it. And that enabled us to start going beyond the course. It's understanding the nuances and figuring out, does that then make sense for you? Do you have problems communicating with executives, or have you already sold them on good learning design? That's the type of understanding you need to distinguish between these. Kirkpatrick model. I was essentially referring to that earlier when I talked about smile sheets versus other things. People revile the Kirkpatrick model, saying it's not a learning evaluation instrument. Others say, no, it's about learning impact. And it starts, when you do it right and start with level 4, you're worried about what's happening with the organization and what changes do we need, and then let's align the learning. It's a good start to performance consulting. But again, if you don't understand the nuances and the differences, you can't make sense of it. Micro-learning. Who hasn't heard about micro-learning of late? And yet, what does it really mean? Some people talk about videos you can access in the moment. That's great. That's also known as performance support. Other people talk about breaking up learning into little chunks and streaming it out over time. That's fabulous too. It's not just you can take a course, break it into chunks, and the learning will happen. You actually have to worry about reactivation and forgetting and things. But that's spaced learning, and it's great. But which one are you talking about when you mention micro-learning? You have to be clear, and there's another interpretation I like, but that's the type of thing. And finally, the experience API. Some people say, oh, it can't measure real learning. And other people say it can track important little details of what people are doing that we want to look at. We want to go beyond just has somebody passed a course and look at, did they access this job aid? Have they read this document? And what impact has that had? By itself, it's not a solution. But when you understand it and understand what it does and doesn't do, you can figure out if it makes sense for you. And again, lots more. So let me ask, why should we care? So people have a little misconceptional problems, or, they got some funny beliefs. Does that really create a problem? And I want to suggest it does. First of all, to the extent that we invest in accommodating these, we invest in testing people with invalid instruments, we say we should design to accommodate different learning styles, we are wasting time and money. We can be expending energy on something that isn't going to make a difference to learning, and we could be expending that energy on things that lead to better learning outcomes. But I think there's two really bigger problems. And the first one is we could be doing things that are actually bad for learning outcomes we're trying to achieve. We could be doing things that will negatively impact learning. And excuse me, I'm coughing a wee bit. and they can be negatively impacting our reputation as professionals. If we're following some of these beliefs, we may as well be looking at astrology or alchemy. It's just not a viable source of professions. So then, if it's harmful and we need to be aware of it, what do we need to know to be able to help ourselves be prepared, be resistant to this? And I want to suggest that, if it's about the brain and learning, we kind of got to understand the brain and learning. Now, at the very low level, our brain is connected of neurons, and learning actually is strengthening certain patterns of neurons in conjunction. So when we see X, we think Y. They activate each other. And the neurons that fire together wire together. And that's important to understand. But when people start talking about neural learning, you have to be wary, because we can't go in and address individual neurons. Instead, we address patterns. Anything we're thinking about is activated as a pattern of activation across neurons. And the way we address that is at the next level, at the cognitive level. So brain-based or neural-based stuff, I'm afraid, generally is hype. People are trying to ride this excitement in neuroscience research, and there's great stuff going on, but it's not at the level that gives us traction to be addressing learning outcomes. Instead, it's at this level, the cognitive level. We have sensory input that comes in. It can be an image, it can be a context, a situation. We have only limited attention, and what we pay attention to is all that gets into our short-term memory, our working memory. Rehearsal will keep it there. What's in short-term memory that gets processed and elaborated eventually works into long-term memory, LTM. Eventually, if we do that enough, and part of the way our brain works, it compiles it away, we can act without even having to become conscious awareness. If you drive an automobile or a bicycle, you recognize that you can begin to think and not have to do it. Even walking, you can probably walk without having to pay conscious attention because it's been automated. And that's what expertise is, and learning is about, is trying to make expertise. But until it becomes automated, it has to be conscious. We need conscious control. We need to watch our behavior and go on. So this is what we do as learning designers. We create experiences that bring stuff into short-term memory, situations. We recall certain elements from long-term memory. We put them together, make a choice of action, and look at the consequences. And in fact, there's certain factors that really influence whether it makes it into long-term memory. So this is the difference between sort of massed practice and spaced practice. If you look at the normal learning curve there, you do a whole bunch of practice. You actually do better on a test right at the end of it, but it dissipates really quickly. By and large, this was your university experience, right? Study the night before the test, pass the test, do well, it's gone 2 weeks later. But if we space it out, you might not do quite as well on the test, which is a problem of these sort of, test focused education experiences. But if we space it out, then we get the space forgetting curve, which retains much better. And if we reactivate it, it's there when we need it. Now, the amount of spacing required and the amount of practice depends on the complexity of the task and how often we perform it. But we need spaced practice. We also need varied practice. It's better if we're retrieving it in the mix of retrieving other things. And it needs to be deliberate practice, that we're doing the specific thing that we need to work on right now. It's not just random practice, any practice. Continued low-level practice isn't going to improve our ability. So we got to get all those elements right. And the way we guide our performance is with models. We build models that explain the world to ourselves. Our brains naturally do this. The problem is, if we aren't given a model, we can build a model that's inappropriate. And then if it's wrong, we don't come back and say, oh, please, sir, may I have a different model? Our brains don't do that. They patch and try and repair the bad model initially. And you end up with this Frankenstein's monster of a patched models that just isn't appropriate. So models are good, but they can lead us to wrong behaviors at the wrong time. So typically the errors you see in learners and in performance aren't random. they're patterned. They tend to be people bringing in models that seem perfectly appropriate, but they're not the right ones. And indeed, when you in your training situation, you should be given the opportunity to make these wrong decisions based on wrong models so you can address them. Our alternatives to the right answer shouldn't be random. There is some randomness in our architecture. It's evolutionarily adaptive. So, we're bad at doing rote things. And pretty much soon, it's safe to say most anything rote will be automated. We want to reserve for ourselves those random things, but trying to have people do rote procedures again and again and again is just doomed to have occasional errors, unless you put in some strong support to help prevent them or to catch them, or automate them and stop having people do them and let people do those complex model-based reasoning that are going to make the biggest difference to your organization. With this limited attention, it's not 10 seconds, but it is limited. The problem is not that we only have 10 seconds of it. It's that we only have a finite amount of it, and it can be misdirected. What we need to do is control the amount of attention that people are subjected to and not add extraneous attention, adding to cognitive load. We need to control this, help people figure out where they should be focusing. We simplify things until they've built it up, that strength, and compiled it away, and then we can deal with more. Our working memory is limited. We can only hold so many things in mind at the same time. And what learning's about is creating bigger and bigger things we can hold in mind. And trying to build that is an important role in our learning design. Our brains compile knowledge away. They compress it down until it's not even available to conscious access. Experts can't tell us 70% of what they actually do. It's not available to their conscious attention, which is why we have to work hard and in special ways to get the information that's critical to the learners, because experts do have access to all the knowledge. So we have to separate out and focus in on the things that learners need to be able to do. And that gives us a guide for designing learning. This is an alternative to Bloom's that came from Brenda Sugru, and I like it. It's much simpler. Bloom's has multiple problems, not least that people have trouble executing reliably against arbitrary distinctions, and it's challenging. But we should be focusing on the outcomes. Instead of adapting to how learner styles or anything, we should be adapting the learning to what our outcomes we need to achieve. And this gives us a better guidance than myths in terms of figuring out what to do. And we need to choose the right media for the message. Too often we hear, oh, it should be video. Video is great when you need to capture context, but it can add a lot of extra unnecessary detail when you really want to focus on the concept. We want to get people think conceptually first and then apply it in contexts. And sometimes we lay over linguistic information, but we want to use the right media for the message and not automatically default. Yes, video can include animation. And if you've seen any Ken Burns or that style of television, they take static images and make videos out of it by having them expand and contract with the narration. But the point is, understand media and don't immediately default to video just because that seems to be the current thing. It would be wonderful if we had magic. And technologically we can bring anything we need anywhere we want, but our brains haven't changed that fast. And so we need to do what aligns with our brains. And there's no magic or silver bullet. We have to do what science has told us works for the best way our brains work. So the question is, how do we make sense of this? At this day, we're wanting to do the best. We're getting hammered by a whole bunch of information. Some of it's real and some of it's not. How do we make sense of this? What are the processes we're going to adopt to try and make this work? And I want to suggest sort of 4 major steps that we can adopt or an alternative. The first one is, and this is sort of compiled from Carl Sagan's 9 Rules to Cut Through BS, and Daniel Willingham recently wrote a set of rules. So this is sort of my summary of it. The first thing is, when there's a claim, somebody's making a claim about something, cut it down to the quick. What does it really tell you you should be doing differently than what you are doing now? What is that? exact claim. Under what conditions should you do this, and what outcomes should you expect? You want to be very clear on that. If you can't get clear on that, it probably can be ignored. Now, the second thing you want to do is track back. Who's making this claim? And what basis are they making it on? Is there a scientific study? Who made the study? Has somebody else validated that study? Do they have a vested interest in this? These are all important questions. If they're trying to sell you this and they make money if they sell you this, show me the data. And when you see the data, put it under the microscope. Look at the methodology. Did they use appropriate subjects? Are these subjects like the ones you have? Did they use an appropriately sufficient body so the statistical tests are valid? Did the statistical methodology they use actually align with the question they're trying to answer? There's a whole bunch of things that can go wrong. One of the things we did when I was training to be a scientist and getting my degree in cognitive science was we looked at rival hypotheses. We had a book of 100 studies, and 6 of them, there weren't alternate explanations. That means 94 had other explanations for the very data they had. Like I was talking about the generations millennials. That's more simply explained by age. And so you really need to drill down and see, is this valid? And finally, you want to give it the sniff test. Does it make a plausible causal story? Yes, we know learners differ, but can we reliably identify them? And does it actually help to teach them differently? Or should we teach them for the outcome? And if they have trouble with that learning approach, scaffold it. Some of this is just, intuition in your area of expertise is a really good test. Outside your area of expertise, it's a problem. Alternatively, you could do another approach. You could look to the people who are analyzing this with an independent viewpoint and credibility. I'm not trying to sell you the book, by the way. In the book and on the site for the book, and you see it down there, Debunking Learning Myths, I have a list of people who have demonstrated consistently an ability to transfer research to practice and to debunk problems. And these are our colleagues and friends who are doing the good work for us. In the book, I do address 16 myths, 5 superstitions, and 16 misconceptions. Believe me, this is ongoing work. I've uncovered many more superstitions that would make a volume 2. It's $70 to $20 US, depending on if you're an ATD member or not. It's coming out at the end of this month. In fact, less than a week. And if you're interested in it, of course, you do get 10% off at ATD with this phrase, Spring Books 18. But you don't need to do that. You can look at the research yourself. You can look to the people who are debunking it. And ATD has their learning sciences list. There's a variety of ways. By the way, if you are, and I saw that the STADA site mentions ATD's International Conference. If you are there, I will be signing the book at 4 p.m. on Tuesday. So if you're there, come by. If nothing else, just say hello, introduce yourself, say you saw me. And if you're willing to listen to me after all this, I greatly appreciate it. Here's the thing, and I apologize again for the cough. We need to stop following bad science. We need to stop with the practices that are undermining our credibility. We need to stop with the practices that are quite possibly hurting the actual outcomes we're trying to achieve. I have seen a lot of people placed into the role of designer or practitioner who were good at their job, whether it was sales or manufacturing or engineering, whatever, and they got hired to be a trainer to communicate to other people. And they may have been okay at this and been trained to be a trainer, but then e-learning came around and people gave them e-learning tools and said, well, you can do the training, you should be able to create e-learning. And they really don't understand it. And e-learning is different than face-to-face training. And even what we tend to do in face-to-face training doesn't necessarily match learning science. We really need our content generation to start reflecting learning science. This is going to play an even more important role as we move to the future of learning. When we start looking at adaptive learning and breaking up content into small chunks, we're going to have to understand how it works to not be wasting money. And representing our industry as practicing professionals, you don't want a medical doctor who doesn't understand blood chemistry. You don't want a pilot who doesn't understand a bit of aerodynamics and emergency engine operation. And we shouldn't want learning designers who don't understand how the human brain learns. And part of that is understanding when we shouldn't and when we follow a path, when we should resist certain beliefs and when we should push for other better design approaches. That's what I'm trying to evangelize. That's what I'm trying to encourage. That's one of the things I think is important and what I care about. We're going to go to questions in just a minute. I want to take a brief moment first to thank you for your attention, to those of you who are still here. Thoughts that end up eventually in books and presentations and elsewhere in articles tend to show up on my blog, learnlets.com. I help organizations that want to take their learning design processes and fine-tune it so that they are making the minimum changes that will have the maximum impact on the outcomes of what they're trying to achieve. I do that with organizations. I've also helped them strategize around mobile learning and the performance ecosystem. I work through Innovation. If you haven't seen the Serious E-Learning Manifesto, this is an initiative with 3 other of our learning evangelists and heroes, Michael Allen of Allen Interactions, and Julie Dirksen of Design for How People Learn, and Will Thalheimer with his work on evaluation. We put together and put out a list of what we think of good principles behind learning. They're not ours. We culled it from research. But if you haven't been there, please go check out elearningmanifesto.org. And if you believe in the principles, please sign on. So at this point, I have talked through what I wanted to talk through, and I'd really like to now have a dialogue with you. If you have any questions, we can try and pop any of these URLs into the chat. But in the meantime, I'm going to return control to the
Roy,
Hangout.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep, I'm back here. Well, I was with you all the while, not back here.
No.
And I'm also learning. And you know what, Clark, I just thought, first of all, let's see if there's anyone that like to ask any questions, and you may pop it up. But just a short dialogue for me, Clark. You know what? It's always so interesting to revisit some concepts, challenge some concepts, and in my perspective, there's one statement that I kind of always put up, and that is learning is dynamic. You know, it just come from so much different angles and so much different situations. And I run workshops, and every time you enter into a workshop, it is just different. This is again a new combination, and you just sometimes can't tell what it is, no matter how much preparation you have. Yeah.
I understand that. By the way, I don't know if you wanted to mention to people that if you roll over to the left, you can see a list of buttons, and that there's a chat available through the blue button. I don't know, and I hope Anton's monitoring the YouTube chat. But I know exactly what you mean, that particularly changing countries, when I do workshops in different countries, their culture about participation can change. And yet I find going into sort of the cognitive commonalities in our brain that cross cultures, ask people questions that they, open-ended questions that they recognize are important and have, and trying to get it, are ways to kick it. Getting people doing things collaboratively, giving them challenges where they have to work together to solve them, again, are really powerful ways to get people applying the knowledge. It's that repeated practice. So you give, one of the things when I run a game design workshop, I start with an initial challenge and I ask people to do a little bit. They so you know, I give them a small challenge and ask them to work it and then have them report back, and then I give them an extension to it. And by the end of it, they've designed a whole game, but it's in little chunks, but it's meaningful activity. It's simple enough they understand, and yet they're getting repeated practice at extending these ideas. It's, you know, it's not ideal. It would be best if they then extended it beyond. In fact, I had one guy who attended my workshop then had me come into his organization and worked with them as they developed some games and gave them feedback over a period of time. It's that extended learning we would like to have. It's just we need to find ways to make sure that what we're doing aligns with our cognitive architecture in some way reflective of, but independent of our culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly. We've got a kind of like a little question here.
Okay.
Yeah, and it says, what do you think of the recent interest in neuroscience field in learning and development, especially pioneered by Dr. David Roth and his age concept?
I don't know that specific piece of information, you know, that specific approach, David Roth and the age concept. But in general, you know, there's some research that's totally legitimate on dopamine and getting into the emotional experience of learning. But the way you generate that is at the cognitive level. You get people engaged, you get stuff. So neuroscience is unpacking. I attended AECT and talked to some folks and listened to a panel on people who are getting down into very neurophysiological effects of learning, and we can find out some outcomes. But what we end up doing in terms of design is still largely based at the cognitive level. It's effectively at the cognitive level. How do we hook people in emotionally up front? How do we cognitively activate the relevant knowledge? How do we give them useful models? How do we give them meaningful practice? It's all still, our interventions can really only be at the cognitive level up until, you know, we start having neural implants, and we are a long ways away from that. And I don't think I want to go there. I think there's important lessons that might be learned from neural, but our actions are going to come at the cognitive level, and that's where I think we should be paying our attention to research and attention to learning sciences.
You mentioned earlier on, well, just to let you know, I was really listening. you mentioned something that's very interesting, and that is outcomes. And could I hear a little bit more about what is said, that it really means, or what are the dimensions of the outcome? Meaning, is it only written specific, or is it more than that?
It's I put up that chart of the Brenda Sugrud's basics thing, and it's aligned with what's coming out of the Learning Science Lab. That's a joint effort between Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh. Now at Carnegie Mellon, but we're finding the sort of core types of learning outcomes we need, and that tends to be, you know, we need people to follow a procedure. Do we need people to be able to make discrimination on the basic of a concept? Do we need people to be able to apply a principle or rule? And determining that, as opposed to, is it, you know, this level of complexity or that level of complexity, what is it you need people to do? I'm actually a fan of a pretty simple distinction that says, and this is semi-based on what Van Marienborg did with his 4-component instructional design. It says, what are the complex decisions we need people to make? And what's the knowledge they need to be able to make that? You know, what is about the context and when to do it? What models do they need to know to be able to make those decisions? That's about as complex as I need it. But what you should be designing the learning experience to do is to get people able to do what it is you need them to be able to do. And it's not about adapting to, you know, are you a visual learner? Well, I am sometimes, and other times it really helps to listen. It changes so much by what you're trying to do. Your best learning design principle is designed for the outcome you're trying to achieve. Figure out what you need people able to do, give them practice to do it, give them support to be able to do it, work backwards. If they, you know, if they can't do it through one shot, figure out the preliminary practices they need. I've argued for a curriculum design that is not based on content, but is based on activity or application of knowledge. What are the series of things people need to do to be able to ultimately be able to do this thing that we need as an outcome?
Sorry, I got the mic off a little while earlier. Yeah, I think it's interesting because here we go. We're kind of like talking about how would we make learning take place, rather than trying to figure out the different learning styles, for example. There's another question coming in. I'll read it.
Please.
You talked about the importance of repeated practice. Do you think 1 or 2 days workshops have any value to create lasting behavioral change? Sorry. From Catherine.
Yes.
From Catherine.
Yeah. Yes, they can, with a caveat. So if it's about what the person has been doing before that workshop happens. So if they're deeply engaged in designing and learning, and you give them some extensive practice on a variation of the designing for learning, that 2 days might lead to some significant change. But if it's totally different, it's unlikely. So there's several circumstances. How close are they to what they're doing in the learning design workshop, and how quickly can they apply it? That the whole thing about spacing is how often are you going to see it afterwards. So if you're putting it into practice right away, it has a good chance of sticking. If you're not, it's up to the learner. Well, it's up to what the learner needs to do is find ways to continue to apply that after learning experience and maybe get feedback. Now, there's 2 ways that can happen. The learner can take the responsibility. A self-active, self-motivated learner can go out and immediately apply it and think it through. And if they're struggling and it's not making sense, they can go look for resources and even ping the workshop presenter. Or the organizers of the workshop or the organization that's brought in the workshop can arrange for explicit reactivation of that knowledge. That's the way to bet, of course, is to ensure that there is a series of chances to apply that knowledge, particularly when it's most likely to be dissipating, to make sure there are challenges that require applying it and are getting feedback. So really intensive workshops that are very closely tied to what the learners are doing can work, but otherwise you really want to extend it with something. I think it's desirable but unfair to expect the learner to be completely able to manage that themselves.
Yes, thank you, Claude. There's a unique question coming in, and it's from a lady, Christine. And she started off by saying, saw you on the screen now. So she's online and she saw me. Hi, Christine. She says this, how do we manage when the global L&D training initiatives, however, the local countries are still running some past initiatives? I am concerned. Oh, hang on, let me finish. I have not finished. I am concerned with the learning from the ground. Does your research on learning applies to the ground and pushing the learning to aging learners? I think it really means that does your research on learning able to apply to the ground and pushing the learning to aging learners? Oh, you and me learn aging learners, yeah.
Right. The principles I've talked about, repeated practice, spaced practice, varied practice, providing models, I believe holds true from pre-kindergarten all the way through, the fullness of life. We know that this stuff works. What we have a small challenge with perhaps, young people have not enough experience, so you have to work on very limited reference points for them, and they can't comprehend very complex models. They have limited working memory. The old people, they tend to have a lot more experience, but things dissipate quickly. So you have to, ideally, our models of learning design are based on models of the learner's knowledge, and we increasingly see that in adaptive learning. And if the model says that for this learner, their knowledge dissipates more quickly, it's harder to get to stick, they're going to require more practice. But it's, the way to adapt is not to the learner, it's to the learning outcome, but it's also to the learner's performance. If they are struggling, give them more simple practice and make sure they've got it automated until you ramp them up. If they're really zooming through this, give them more complex practice. That's the right type of adaptation, is both to the learning outcome and to their ability to demonstrate it through their behavior and their prior knowledge. That's what you should be doing. And if older people, tend to have struggle remembering it more, it may take more work to automate it. But the underlying architecture of our learning doesn't change that much based upon age.
Okay, that was Catherine. I just thought I'd add a few more words to that. It's again one of my personal belief, and I say this: everything is about the learners. We do it really depending on the learners, perhaps even depending on the learners that particular day's capabilities. We have another question. Robert is online, and he's our CEO. So I thought maybe we just ask him to say something.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Hello.
Hi, Clark. Thank you for doing this webinar for us. I think it's very interesting to note certain points that you have shared, especially with regards to, I wouldn't use the word older, but more senior workers, I suppose, less sensitive, I think. but I think you have a point that for the more seniors workers, you struggle with trying to be familiar with the transition from what you used to into using technology and equipment and that need to understand and remember. But like they always say, practice makes perfect. But I think for the older people, the key is not only practice, the key is to have that mindset of wanting to do that transition, right? Most of the time, if you don't have that positive mindset to want to do that transition, everything seems to be difficult. Everything seems to, I cannot remember, can you tell me again? And if you do that too often, your fellow younger colleague will also get uptight with you because you keep coming back to them, and you can then becomes a nuisance. And also the posturing becomes one that you are not learning. Yeah. So those are my intake. Yeah.
That's interesting, Robert, and that may change a wee bit, but I want to suggest that there's a lot of stuff people talk about. Oh, for millennials, you got to help them understand why it's important, and it's got to be more interactive and stuff. That's not just for millennials. A lot of the stuff we've done in the past for our learning designs aren't the best, and we should be doing the best. And your point about essentially what I take you to be saying is that we need to hook people in emotionally, help them understand why it's important and why they should invest the effort and the outcomes they're going to get. It should all be about WIF and what's in it for me. And I think that's absolutely right. But I think that's true for at all ages. We don't do a good enough job of addressing the emotional side of the learning experience. I talked at the recent Learning Solutions Conference specifically about engagement, about how we align what we do cognitively with what we do emotionally to make the experience compelling. And I think that holds true for every age. And it may be more challenging for older people because they have more experience that can interfere. One of the things I address in the book is unlearning. There's this myth that you have to unlearn before you can learn something new. Actually, you can't unlearn. That's not the way our brains work. You have to overlearn. You have to learn over it until you've essentially replaced that behavior with a new one that's more effective. And it may be harder for older people because they have more, their experience has developed stronger old learning that will be hard to replace. But I still think that you're absolutely right. If they don't understand why they should care, it will be hard for them to invest the effort to make that transition.
Okay, we've got just time for one last question, Clark, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah, and it says here from Freddie, do you have any experience on cross-cultural perspective on learning math? For example, how do countries in Asia respond or adopt a certain practice differently as compared to the West?
I do have some experience. So I taught for a number of years in Australia, and there we had a lot of Asian students who came to our university. And I became curious. I wanted to make sure I was doing the best thing, and I took a workshop on multicultural teaching. And they talked about, there's sort of this myth, at least in sort of Australia, US, UK, that, Asian learners learn very much by rote. And what they helped us unpack is that in Asian cultures, you tend to venerate scholarship, which is a good thing. I used to love going to academic conferences in Asia because they really treated us well. In the US, they'd put us out at the dodgy motel. But the way you honor your scholars then is to recite back to them what you heard. So this got misinterpreted as, they only know how to do rote learning. And that's wrong. And what this workshop told us about is, no, it's just that that's their culture. Our brains are capable of learning in a multitude of ways. But if that hasn't been the way we've learned through our culture, we may need support to accommodate this new cultural learning. But at the end of the day, the best learning design is still the best learning design. If that's not what they're familiar with or comfortable. And when I was teaching, I taught interface design, and I taught a lot of Asian students who were also computer scientists. And I used to tell them, don't trust your own instincts. You don't think like normal people. You've been highly selected to be able to understand complex and arbitrary syntaxes. But I gave them the challenging problem-based assignments, and this wasn't what they were used to. Even in our School of Computer Science, it was a third-year subject, and they hadn't had experience with it. I learned I had to scaffold it and help them understand what I expected and how to do this and stuff, but then they were capable of it. So it's, to me, cultural differences may create initial conditions, but when you do good learning design and scaffold people into that, you're going to get the best outcomes that you can get. Does that make sense? I hope that's the way I see it.
Yes, I do. Hope that that answers the question. And once again, Clark, thank you very much. I'm gonna put this session to a close. Thank you for being awake at this hour. At your end, we're not younger, so it's resting time. I still like to borrow one of the books behind you someday.
This one.
Yeah. No, I'll pick that one up. And,
yeah, no, there's some great books out there. I referred to a few, but yeah. And yeah, once again, thank you very much to the rest of us. Thank you for tuning in. You can go to STADA YouTube channel, or subscribe to our channel, watch the webinar sessions, or you can follow us on social media for the rest of the insights on workplace learning and development. So
Roy,
yes,
Roy,
Robert,
can I just interject for 2 minutes?
Sure.
Thank you. I think I just want to take on the point that Clark has just mentioned and about culture learning, about culture and learning. And I think he is absolutely right that at the end of the day, it's about framework. If we get the framework right, you can teach people to have a deeper understanding of learning, right? So that at the end of the day, when you are not sure, you can fall back on framework, and that will help you to define your way, so that whether which culture you're from, then your way of your culture can then be the guide to that framework for a deeper learning. That's my comment. I thought that was a very important point, that we need to understand that whatever we do, we need to have that framework, so that it helps us to put everything in not only in the right perspective, but in the right context.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert, for joining us. Thank you, Clark, once again. Thank you, everybody.
You, Roy. Thank all the attendees.
Yes, thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Roy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.